Great. Well, we have a fantastic number of people here with us. So let's dive right in. My name is David Sasaki. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I direct the Boys and Men online program at the American Institute for Boys and Men. And it's a research and advocacy program that explores the ways that digital technologies shape the emotional, social, and financial lives of young men. One of the areas that we study, obviously, is sports betting. And in partnership with Arnold Ventures and with some additional support from the Achelis and Bodman Foundation, we recently launched the Sports Betting Research and Policy Hub. This was just a couple of weeks ago. We launched it along with a policy framework. I will put a link in the chat that is a menu of approaches towards sensible sports betting reform that preserves the fun of sports betting while preventing some of the harms that have started to accumulate. I am thrilled that Jonathan Cohen has joined us at the American Institute for Boys and Men to lead this work. I can't think of a better person. John is the author of Losing Big, America's Reckless Bet on Sports Gambling. He is a frequent media commentator. You might have seen him on CNBC's Squawk Box just this morning talking about this very issue. And this is week number 2 of John being with us. So this is just like typical onboarding at AIBM that we would expect all new employees to host a really big webinar with very esteemed panelists. I'm excited for this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off so I can enjoy this just like the rest of you. But John, I will hand it over to you to introduce our esteemed panelists.
Thanks, David, and thanks everyone for being here or watching this live or watching this recording or listening to this in podcast form, which I think we will have up within a matter of days. As David was sort of suggesting, we envision the AIBM Gambling Hub as a place for lawmakers, regulators, journalists, industry members, and advocates. And we hope that sort of members from all of those groups are going to turn to us for the latest research and the latest ideas. And in this industry of all industries, a lot of those people don't always talk to one another or don't always play nicely with one another. And we hope that they can find a space to find common ground and to at least share best practices and best ideas. So whether you think that legalized gambling is a huge problem or you think that the problem are all the people who think that legalized gambling is a huge problem, we hope that AIBM sort of offers something for you and will have something to help you and help you in your work. In fact, I know we have something for you today because, as David said, we have 3 great panelists with 3 very divergent perspectives, I think, on all sorts of things who are going to help us understand a very tumultuous year. Sort of every year is a tumultuous year in the world of gambling, but last year, I think, especially tumultuous in the world of gambling policy, and then looking ahead to what is coming down the pike over the next 11 to 12 months or so. And so let me just introduce our panelists briefly, and I will encourage folks anytime over the course of the conversation to put questions into the Q&A function. We can't view your chat, but we can view Q&A. So if you put anything into the Q&A, we will, with about 20 minutes left in the program, try to aggregate as many of those as we can and toss them around to the right people. So our panel today, starting with Chris Grove, who is an industry veteran, a strategic advisor to leading gambling brands, a venture investor, and a partner emeritus at Eilers & Krejcik, a boutique research firm for the gambling industry. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Steve Ruddock runs Straight to the Point Consulting, and he is the author of the Straight to the Point newsletter, which I'll speak personally, I find to be an absolutely indispensable source of news for everything about gambling, and sometimes jujitsu. Hi, Steve. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, John. Thanks.
And Brianne is a lobbyist with her own boutique lobbying firm, and you may know her especially from her work in basically every state house across the country, and then in particular her work with and for the campaign for fair gambling. And Brianne, I'm just going to start with you right off the bat with a nice, easy sort of fastball right down the middle. What do you see as the biggest gambling story, let's say, of the last 12 months or so? How are we going to remember 2025? If you can give it a quick little summation.
A quick summation. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me, first off. When I think about 2025, when we look back on the year, I'm thinking it's going to be just as pivotal as 2018 was with the Murphy case. And I see that if I have to choose one item. It was the seismic shift that we saw within the industry and the departure of the three behemoths of sports betting operators and their departure from the American Gaming Association. I think it signaled a lot of what was a priority for the industry, where they were going to focus their efforts. And really, it all had to do with this inclusion or introduction of the prediction markets, right? And so for me, it wasn't just a little bit of a change. It was what I would consider to be a seismic shift in the industry and its subsequent priorities.
I had over under 4 minutes to say for someone to use the word prediction markets, and we hit it right at 5 minutes. So thank you.
Yeah, see, I'm here to deliver.
Steve, I'm curious if you guys agree with Brianne's assessment or would have anything to add for your own sort of biggest takeaway from the last year.
Yeah,
Look,
I
I
think
would
that-
say, go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to say, I think Brianne hit it on the head. I think as tumultuous as the year was, that we learned a lot about where the industry's wedges are. And as Brianne said, we saw a few people leave the AGA. We saw online focus companies kind of lining up on one side. We always had this rift within the industry, but everybody had been playing nice since about 2018. And I think we're starting to see those mid-2010s rifts start to reemerge.
Yep. Can't offer anything additionally. I think we're going to look back on 2025 and the headline, the year will get compressed into it being the year that prediction markets emerged and upended much of the gambling industry. It does fit within a broader theme of an increasing impact of the federal government on gambling in the US. And while I think that was most keenly felt in terms of prediction markets being enabled by a federal regulatory authority, the CFTC, you also saw the impact from the so-called Big Beautiful Bill and the issue with tax withholding rearing its head. And then obviously the broader policy of this administration on trade having a material impact on tourism here in Las Vegas. So a few different threads that all go back to, in many ways, the same source, an increasingly robust federal government, and that robustness increasingly intruding on the normal course of business for what has historically been largely a state-regulated enterprise.
So, Chris, maybe this is to your point, and notwithstanding Brienne's travel calendar the last year, but it seemed like it was actually a pretty quiet year on the regulatory front in terms of there were a couple attempts to sort of pass it. And obviously, Missouri went live just in December. But other than that, how much of this sort of focus, or the fact that all of you are sort of gravitating to this one story about prediction markets, is the fact that sort of we were getting a little bit of maturity from the market. We weren't getting many new states on board, and the states that were trying to legalize iGaming or online casino, many that didn't go through. Is that part of the story, or is that contributing to the fact that prediction markets are actually the story?
Look, I think those two things are more happening in parallel. The impact of prediction markets, seismic is the right way to think about it in terms of degree. And some of that is a function of the actual size of prediction markets, how many folks participate, the economics, the financial picture, but also some of it has to do with the folks who are involved, the entry of a Robinhood into the sphere, the entry of a Coinbase into the sphere, the entry of ICE, the owner of the New York Stock Exchange, not Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which I know caused a little bit of confusion the day that investment into Polymarket was announced. So that shifting of the stakeholder picture on the, how's the industry progressing? What did the year look like in that sense? I don't know that I would call it mature. I mean, you're still seeing substantial growth for regulated online sports betting. You're still seeing incredibly material growth for regulated online casino. And you're also seeing the continued evolution of the companies that participate in those markets. So none of them feel like they're standing still. Those markets don't feel like they're standing still in terms of growth and economic performance. To your point, though, Jonathan, there definitely is less progress in terms of state legislatures authorizing continued expansion in terms of new states, new markets. Most of the legislative focus in 2025 was punitive, either in terms of outlining forms of gambling or gambling-like activity that couldn't be conducted in states. We saw a lot of anti-sweepstakes bills get across the finish line in 2025, or punitive in the sense of placing additional restrictions or levying tax increases against regulated online casino and sportsbook operators.
Yeah, Brianne, Steve, I'm curious if you agree, and maybe broaden this out to think about what the last year was like, sort of in terms of the political wins or even the public opinion wins, and how those changed or maybe didn't change. Especially thinking about especially about the NBA scandal that broke in October, which we've gone now 10 minutes without talking about, which is I think a record probably for a webinar of this kind.
Good, Steve, you can go first.
Oh, I can go first. Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting time on the legislative calendar, and I think to Chris's point, what you see a lot of times is when there is a legislative slowdown. So we had this mad rush of whether it was daily fantasy sports circling right into sports betting, and then that started slowing down. You start to see these vacuums emerge, and that's where you start to see other, innovative forms of gaming, gambling, sports event contracts, whatever you want to call them, start to have an opportunity to grab some market access that just isn't available to licensed operators. And I saw that first with sweepstakes in 2024. They kind of became the big story. And then that kind of, as Chris said, they kind of ran into some regulatory and legislative headwinds. And then you started to see prediction markets just zoom right in. And whatever happens with prediction markets, if the licensed industry is limited to 7 or 8 states, you're just going to see another product try to fill that vacuum down the road.
For me, I think it was about an opportunity to ensure that they weren't left behind, right? There was this unexpected shift at the federal level, like in February, right? There was this idea, maybe we should discuss these products. Is there an opportunity or a chance here, right? Nobody could have forecasted that by December be a full-fledged market of its own at the size that it is, right? The traditional sports betting operators saw an opportunity and they were going to seize it because they want to compete. They're good at this, right? Think about the migration from fantasy to sports to now prediction markets, right? There's always this evolution, this disruption. How that's impacted policy, though, has been interesting, right? So to Chris's point, a lot of the policies that we saw proposed last year were either loosely defined, let's dip our toe in the water, is expansion feasible? It was a lot of interest on consumer protections, tax rates, right? Not about expansion. But I don't think that's what led to the prediction market expansion, right? Yes, frustration, what's happening, pressure from the industry that we needed another year of growth. That wasn't happening, but I don't think there's a causal relationship there. But I do think it's why we're seeing more pushes this year, because last year was probably one of the slowest that we had seen from an expansion standpoint.
Okay, so in that vein, and I have a PhD in history, so I'll talk about the past for forever. But I think people are here because they want to know what's coming more so than sort of interested in relitigating. And so I'd love to turn then on that note to what you all think is sort of coming down the pike. And I've been assured by all of our panelists that they have bought event contracts with their predictions. So they have actual money behind these predictions. These are not just their bloviating opinions that they are throwing out without actual investment in their ideas. So Steve, maybe I'll start with you because you're, I'm just getting all my information from you basically anyway, every day in your newsletter. So when it comes to sort of Brianne's last point about sports gambling legalization, what are 1 or 2 states that come to mind for you that are on your radar for 2026?
So my bloviated opinion on this is that it's every year we start the legislative calendar and everybody starts pointing to states that are going to have a good shot at legalizing. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I think everybody has come to the conclusion that maybe there will be 1 or 2 that do something. There isn't this dam breaking idea that everybody thinks is going to happen. It's just not the way state legislatures work. It's not the way they're going to work in an election year. There are just too many individual stakeholders in these states that have different opinions, even if they all want the same thing. They all want it done in a different way, whether it's tribal commercial. We've seen Penn Entertainment, which is very much in online gaming, and they've come out against some bills in recent years. We saw FanDuel come out against the main bill last year because they didn't like the structure of it. So there's all these different forces at play when we're looking at online casino, which, I mean, Chris and Brianne know this as well as I do, is just not a topic that state lawmakers are very well versed in, or that they really want to have a vote on where it's in public, just because there is still something to be said about vice industries and how those play. And if you're a state legislator and you're up for reelection every 2-3 years, that becomes a really big problem. If one of your opponents or a company that doesn't like what you did suddenly starts backing somebody else in a state race, it's much easier to influence it with a little bit of money.
Well, Chris and Brianne, I want to get your thoughts, but Steve, I want you to name one state that you're actually looking at, not just explain how this process works.
I would probably say New Hampshire would be the most likely one, but even there, you have. I'm going to caveat that with it's not the greatest state in the world for that, just because there's a lot of stakeholder disagreement. But yeah.
Like I think Steve made all the points well. You have to bucket sports betting and online casinos separately when you're having this conversation. So starting with sports betting, the states that are left for a reason. There aren't that many left. Sports betting has been successful from a revenue generation and a tax generation perspective. It hasn't been without its scandals, but in terms of if states are looking for models about how this can benefit their budgets, there are plenty out there for them to choose from. So the ones that are left because they're hard. And they're hard for different reasons. Steve alluded to most of them. Most of them are specific to the individual states. So you do need to zoom into the state level to really appreciate what makes the bill difficult in one state versus the next. For online casino, it's a different story. Americans, by and large, do not think about sports betting as gambling. Can't tell you how many state legislatures I've gone into, and when I'm talking to a group, one of the first questions I ask is how many people in here gamble. And if there's 30 people in the room, maybe 5 hands will go up. And then I'll ask how many people in here bought a lottery ticket in the last year, and inevitably more hands than 5 go up. And I'll ask how many people bet on sports or played fantasy sports for real money, and certainly more than 5 hands will go up. To Steve's point, there just isn't the same acceptance of or consensus around online casino. I think those bills will continue to be incredibly difficult to get done. And I think states, instead of authorizing additional products, if they already have online sports betting, are in the aggregate more likely to turn to the question of how can we get more money out of our existing operators, because this is already done. And it's a lot easier to raise $100 million by increasing taxes on existing online sports betting operators than it is to raise a similar amount by passing a new bill, putting a quote unquote casino in every pocket. Those are two very different propositions from a political capital perspective. So don't expect there to be much, if any, movement on the legislative front this year. But I've been saying that for a few years, and certainly run the risk of being wrong one of these years. We'll see.
Brianne, you're in these state houses with Chris, usually on the opposite side of the bill from him. So I'm curious what you think.
I know, I didn't even pay him to say that online casino in your pocket. Thanks for that. Look, so sports betting states that we're watching are the states that have tried several times, gotten close, but maybe didn't make it over the finish line. So I'm actually going to say, from an expansion standpoint, kind of interested in what's going on in Hawaii, right? One of the 2 states without any form of legalized gambling. It made it further last year in its debate than ever before. And I think that there's an interest and a fear, both sides, right? But that bill's alive again. And so I'm watching. I would have said Minnesota, but there are strong other political happenings there that I think pretty much compromise, right? And then, there's Georgia. Georgia's back. They're going to try and expand, although this is a lottery expansion. So that in itself could prove to be a difficult hurdle that's insurmountable. But those are the ones that I think are in play. Now, for me, I don't just watch bills that are for further expansion, right? I am looking at those constraints, those reforms, the consumer protections. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of action this year. Traditionally, election years, no gaming policy one way or the other happens. Like Steve said, legislators don't want to be affiliated with a vote in public on gambling unless they are really strong-armed into it. And I think this year in light of some recent studies, research reports, we are going to see some pretty big markets trying to address sports betting harms. I'm watching New York. If everybody on this call is not watching New York, then start, because there's going to be some movement one way or the other, I think, there. And then as for online casino, well, no secret, I am on the other side of Chris and others on this one. But I do think that it's a hard pill to swallow. It invokes a very different emotion from folks when you're talking about putting a full-fledged casino on your phone in your homes. I don't think that there's the appetite that we experienced after the Murphy case in 18 to like see, 5-6 states move at a go.
And Jonathan, there's a really interesting contrast to be drawn, pulling it back to the original question about what was the story of last year and all of us talking about prediction markets. On one hand, you've got the regulated side for digital, and you have a deceleration. And it feels like it is getting more and more difficult to get things done. And it also feels like it is more and more difficult for these businesses to be productive and profitable for a wide array of competitors. The economic benefits really seem to be accruing to the top 2, 3, maybe 4 operators in these markets. So you've got what I call just a general state of deceleration, of expansion and opportunity, an increase of friction. On the other hand, you've got just the absolute opposite trajectory for these businesses, these verticals that are gambling adjacent or gambling like, or tap into the same mechanisms that make a consumer interested in playing a game. It has never cost less money to develop a game from scratch in human history than it costs right now. And that cost is about to take another step change down, thanks to vibe coding and Claude and these sorts of tools that involve the automation of so much of the coding process. It has never cost less at any point during my career, and I think never at any point in human history, to reach a mass audience for whom your game is relevant and of interest, to bring that product to market. So the speed at which these new products can be launched that sit outside of the regulatory structure, and the opportunities and the distribution of those opportunities from an economic perspective, all that is expanding and accelerating at the very same time that the regulated opportunity is becoming less and less attractive and more difficult and reserved for a smaller and smaller group of stakeholders. These are just very fundamental economic pressures that, regardless of your perspective from a moral perspective or an ethical perspective, you show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. And the incentives right now are all heavily in the direction for the vast majority of stakeholders and actors to pursue the adjacent categories, not the regulated categories.
So Chris, for folks who don't know, Chris is describing sort of black market or unregulated operators, if you, depending how kind you want to be, and Steve and Brianne, I'll get your thoughts on this too. I'm curious, to Brianne's point, if we move away from thinking about expansion and we think about reform in one way or another as being sort of the focus of where states' energy is going to be, and where maybe even the most likely viability, where we might actually see some bills pass in the course of this calendar year, is the black market, or are these unregulated operators, is that going to be a priority, or can they expect that to be a priority? And what would action in that direction look like, especially at the state level or maybe even at the federal level?
Sure, I'll start, and I know Brianne and Steve definitely have thoughts. First, equal and opposite reaction. So as we just talked about, that deceleration versus that acceleration, as you do see more restrictions on the regulated product, you are creating the expansion of the surface area for folks that do not have to adhere to those restrictions. And so policymakers, I think, just have to be aware that these decisions don't occur in a vacuum. They occur in a broader context where consumers have access to a wide array of products. And it's not a binary, right? It's not illegal versus legal. The nature of gambling law in the US, it's patchwork, it's ambiguous, and it's going to constantly be tested at the margins thanks to those economic forces that we just described. So that certainly isn't an argument, by the way, against reform. It certainly isn't an argument against making the regulated product better, making it safer, making it something that it's easier for more consumers to engage with in a way that's sustainable and responsible. It's just an argument for, you can't make those kinds of policy decisions pretending that the only product that consumers have access to is the product that you directly regulate as the state. That's where I think you start to wander into wishing for a world that you hope would exist versus living in the world that actually does as a policymaker. And that can be some pretty dangerous terrain.
Yeah, Steve, for Brianne, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, it's it to what Chris said, and I this is something I picked up from Chris a long time ago, actually, when we worked together, was it's a lot easier to regulate something that already exists than it is to take something that's illegal and make it legal. So I think that's where we're at. And his point about it's not a matter of do we want legal online casino in our state? It's a matter of how do we want it in our state, because it already exists in our state. So do we want it regulated? Do we want it run through our local casinos? Do we want it open more market access? Do we want it as a state-run lottery monopoly? There's all these ways that it can be done. I think states really need to start grappling with what are we going to do about this? And one of those options is nothing, but you are going to have online casino players in your state. You're going to have people betting on sports in your state, whether you like it or not. So it's just a matter of how does the state want to tackle it? What are they willing to do? And then it's also, that's where the stakeholder disagreements come in, and how do we deal with all of these different stakeholders and what they want. And then from there, we can then start to look at, okay, so we have all of these, who's ready to compromise and who's not, and who's going to stay out on the margins. And the rift within the AGA this year, I believe, is very telling, that you have these groups of operators that have always been envelope pushers, so to speak. And you have this group of legacy operators who are more, no, this is how things are done. Everybody get in line. When I lived in Germany, you did not cross a road unless the walking signal was there. And if you did, somebody would yell at you about the Kinder, even if it was 2:00 in the morning and there was no car on the road. So that's how I look at the legacy operators in the space. They have too much at stake with their core businesses, where these other operators that are, online focused, or even still operating gray, black, whatever you want to call it, they don't have as much to risk by pushing the envelope. So they have a different strategy. And that's where I think you get a lot of these different butting of heads between legacy operators and these, what I'll just term as disruptors.
I come at the illegal situation a lot differently. We hear concerns around illegal operators, gray, whatever, black market operators, as justification to further expand, right? You very rarely hear it in the context of constraint. And I like to say, I don't think this is needing to be binary. Like, why aren't we talking about reform or enforcement? Like, why is the illegal market presence somehow the justification to go and increase the entire total market space? No doubt illegal operations are harmful to consumers, but I just think that the way it's being presented right now, a lot of times in State House, is there's this big bad boogie illegal market, and we should at least profit off of it. So let's legalize and expand. And then we're just growing the total market. I get very frustrated about the way we talk about the illegal market right now. Is it a concern? Sure. But I don't think that the solutions that are often being presented really address the illegal market or disruptors that will still come down the pipeline, right? Like the way we're talking about prediction markets, some states are calling them illegal. How you define it, how you use it in state houses, I mean, it's just kind of a catch-all as I see it right now, without a lot of thought behind it.
Yeah, Brianne is right. I mean, illegal has become a synonym, at least in some conversations, for a thing we don't like, which is not always the case. And when the conversation gets abstracted to that level, to Brianne's point, you miss the opportunity to have the tougher conversation around, okay, well, what is it in our gambling laws or our approach to gambling that creates these opportunities? What is it within the structure of our regulated gambling operations or structure that creates these opportunities? What is it in terms of our enforcement that creates these opportunities? There's more of an interplay between the two than we often reveal when we have these conversations, because we do have them at sort of a surface soundbite level. It certainly is accurate to say that regulated gambling has the potential to siphon oxygen from the illegal market, but it's also accurate to say, at least from my perspective, that Brianne's point is correct, and that regulated gambling also expands the total surface area and the total market and the total access for and participation in regulated gambling. And the reality is that conversation about what the best equilibrium is a complex one, and it's not one that has really been part of, or I wouldn't say part of, hasn't been a North Star for policy discussions in the US. I don't have a silver bullet for addressing that, but I do think it is important to inject a greater amount of nuance along the lines of what Brianne is suggesting into the conversation, that it can't just be this one-for-one trade-off of the only way to get rid of the illegal market is to introduce a legal market, and that the benefits of introducing a legal market in terms of diminishing the illegal market are assumed to be on face sufficient to overwhelm whatever harms the introduction of the expansion of legal gambling might cause. That it's also very tough math to do, to be honest, because it relies on a number of assumptions and look-throughs into data that just doesn't have the level of opacity that you'd like.
Yeah, and it's interesting when we look at, there's always going to be a black market, doesn't matter, and for good reason. Some of the money that would get funneled, if there was no black market, some of the money that would get funneled through the legal market is not money you want in the legal market, right? There's different things at play. So we're never really, I've called it a black market boogeyman, which is it's just something that is going to exist. There are people who don't want it on their taxes. There are people who just don't want to have their wife know that they're betting sports. There are wives who don't want their husbands to know they're betting sports. There are all these things. And I think it's, when we look at it, we really have to look at what is the legal market supposed to be, and what is it not supposed to be. If your whole goal is to just offset money from illegal operators, you're going to basically be running the same industry as what you're trying to get rid of, because you're never going to get all of that money. I mean, anecdotally, just from there is, to Brianne's point, there is a huge sector of people who will only bet legally. The reason they are not betting now is because it's not legal. I've said that, I've given this anecdote before, but when Massachusetts legalized sports betting, I play in a home poker game, and I went there, and it was right around March Madness, and suddenly 25 people there were very interested in watching March Madness and telling everybody about their bets. Never heard this before, never seen it before. Basically, one or two people there was probably betting sports illegally, and now 25 people were betting. And it's based from legalization. So there is an expansion of the overall player pool, and I think that's the player pool we need to be most concerned about, which is these people who are coming in and basically just like a high school kid or a college kid starting to drink. They're still trying to figure out what their tolerance is, and sometimes that can have some pretty bad results.
So speaking of boogeymen, and with an eye on the clock and wanting to get to Q&A, I do want to sort of have a full-throated conversation about prediction markets as well, which, just to Steve's sort of last point, are lacking by many state attorneys general accused, sort of lacking of these consumer protections that are either required or that are desired of traditional sports books, and as many lawsuits allege, are sort of in violation of state gambling laws, because they, as folks might know, claim to be regulated by the Commodities Futures Trading Commission at the federal level, and therefore are not subject to state regulation. I think folks, at least in the gambling world, are probably familiar with all these dynamics. So I sort of want to jump into with both feet to this conversation, Chris, but maybe with a question for you, which is specifically, the major sports books, and Brianne started us out by talking about the Rift and the AGA. FanDuel, DraftKings, Fanatics have each launched their own prediction markets, or are about to launch their own prediction markets. And I'm curious if you think that this is sort of a real venture. Are they really trying to become prediction market companies and have this be a core part of their business? Or is this just a way to sort of keep the engine running until California, until Texas, until some of these other states come on board with legal sports gambling of their own.
I don't think this is a head fake in any way, shape, or form. And this is a material decision with material consequences, not the least of which are the potential consequences threatened by regulators in multiple states. Ohio, Michigan, and Arizona come to mind. So I would not regard this as a flight of fancy or a stopgap solution. You've got that risk, that overhang. You also have the risk, the overhang of this is a significant commitment of resources and energy for companies that are in a cutthroat and competitive market. They didn't have 150 people sitting around waiting to be activated to work on something. So again, those people, that time, that energy, that resource, that all comes at an expense. And the expense is improving their products for markets where they're already making money today and where they're fighting tooth and nail for market share today. But the last point I'll make ties back to what I said earlier about that equilibrium. Is it a stopgap for a California or a Texas? Look, if I am DraftKings or FanDuel, the opportunity to operate a sports betting like product tax-free in a major population state is not a stopgap. It's a superior solution to the alternative of legislated OSB that could come with a tax rate as high as 51% if New York is the ceiling. And the ceiling might even be higher, let alone whatever other regulatory costs increase your effective tax rate. So I think sometimes people misunderstand, because we've been saying for so long that the holy grail for these companies is OSB in California or OSB in Texas or access to Florida. And that's not quite right. The holy grail is the access to these markets with a profitable product that sits within their core competency. Doesn't necessarily have to be state regulated OSB. Certainly could be prediction markets, or could be whatever the next thing is. And let's be clear, there will be a next thing, and it will come on a faster iterative cycle than we've become accustomed to because of those advancements in technology, marketing, et cetera. So long answer to your question, Jonathan. The short answer is they are not playing at this. This is a real opportunity. They're taking a real risk, committing real resources. And at least in some ways, from some angles, they may view this as a better outcome than getting a bill passed in a state like California or Texas.
Really, really interesting. Brianne, I'm curious how prediction markets, because you're doing a lot of work at the state level. You do work in Congress as well, which we should talk about. But I'm curious how prediction markets, especially, are sort of impacting the work and the conversations you're having with lawmakers.
So I think that it's doing two things. It's drawing attention to what other gambling or gambling-like products consumers have access to, right? And then what are those outcomes, good, bad, or indifferent, right? When I'm talking across the US to state policymakers, we talk about things like underage participation, right? Prediction markets, 18, not 21, like traditional sports betting. So there's some discussion around what does it mean, and not necessarily like, can the big three compete now because they're not paying taxes? Like, although that is relevant in Congress, right? The sports betting excise tax. I do think that would be an opportunity for the federal government to intervene with illegal gambling, right? Where prediction markets, they exist. There's very limited regulation prescribed around them. And I think that state policymakers are worried about two things. Does this impact the revenue that they're getting from sports betting? Is this going to compromise the market? They allocate all of those revenue dollars to things like education, clean water, right? So there's real concern. Does the proliferation of prediction markets threaten that? And also, what is going to be the impact on our people? I think that it shouldn't be viewed as, is this a stopgap for Texas and California? I think it should be more, is this a stopgap till there's a new administration? And does it go away potentially as quickly as it came? So I always feel like I'm the Debbie Downer of the group, you guys.
I think maybe that's appropriate for this one. With an eye on the clock here, I want to do a quick sort of rapid fire round. Just go to each of you with sort of, I'll do Brianne, then Steve, then Chris with a couple of, I think 4 questions, and then I'll turn to Q&A. So folks have questions. We've gotten a bunch in already, but please do either continue to submit or submit questions for the first time in through that function. So, okay, Brianne, I'm going to start with you. Just sort of really quick off the bat answers. A state we haven't talked about that yet that you think people should be watching for when it comes to sports betting for this year for any reason.
Alaska.
Alaska. Steve, same question, but for online casino.
Online casino. Oh, give me the hard one. Vermont.
Chris, FanDuel, DraftKings have approximately 80% market share on online sports betting. Do you think that number is higher or lower at the end of this year?
Lower. That number is decidedly trending down. Just a lot more numbers below 80 than above.
Brianne, what is going to be the next trendy idea in sort of the gambling reform world that you think is going to sort of take off in the next few months?
EIP.
Steve, are we going to see any push for reform or advertising limit at the state or the federal level?
I think you're definitely going to see it at both.
Both. Chris, we were talking about this a little bit, but the black market, what do you think is sort of the next wave other than strongly worded cease and desist letters from either state or federal government about black market operators?
I think you're going to see more emphasis on legislative solutions. I think there was a lot of success with that approach from the folks who are pushing back against the expansion of sweepstakes. And so you'll continue to see more legislative. Careful what you wish for. A lot of things can get attached to those bills is the concern I would have.
Brianne, are there any political groups or offices who have been quiet about gambling for the last couple of years who you think sort of might come out of the woodwork in the next few months and start getting involved in this issue?
I mean, I think, am I coming out of the woodwork?
They don't have to come that far out of the woodwork. They can be very lightly in the woodwork.
I don't know. I think that overwhelmingly most offices have been quiet and that anybody could actually come forward and have an opinion. Sorry, that was kind of a non-answer.
Steve, do you think the media coverage of the industry and of gambling changes at all in tone over the next year? Sorry.
I think it definitely will. We're seeing a lot of newsrooms cutting staff, so mainstream press. So I think you might see a lot more of the industry press becoming mainstream press for the industry.
Interesting. And then Chris, you are decidedly the industry guy on this panel. So I'm curious, what's one piece of advice or idea you have for the sort of the harm reduction public health people of the world that you think would bolster their work?
Sure. I think a lot of the industry would be surprised to hear me described as the industry guy.
It's all relative. It's all relative.
Maybe I'll get that put onto a t-shirt. I do think there's going to be more of an emphasis and should be more of an emphasis on data sharing and just unfettered and consolidated access to data by regulators. So consolidated not just at the state level with individual operators, but consolidated across states. Without that consolidated picture, I think it's difficult to enact, measure, and progress any kind of reform.
Okay, and then just quick, these are just over-unders. Brianne, California sports betting legalization, before or after 2029?
After.
Steve, number of athlete scandals, gambling scandals from major sports leagues in 2026, over under 1.5.
Over.
And then Chris, number of prediction markets with over at least 10% market share at the end of 2026, over under 3.5.
I'll just hit the over on all three.
Okay.
I would like to parlay all three overs, please.
You can get great odds on that.
Yeah, or combo if it's on a prediction market.
Combo,
yep.
Right.
Words matter. Yeah.
So thank you all very much. So I am going to sort of look through some of these questions, and a lot of them are sort of concentrating around general questions about let's call them kids and kids' access to online gambling. And folks may have seen a report from Common Sense Media that an estimate that based on a survey about 1,000 11 through 17-year-olds, I think 30% or so had gambled in the last year. Some of that was on fantasy sports, some of that was on sort of traditional gambling. So I'm curious from sort of any reflection you have either on that report, if you've read it, or on the general issue about things you think, the ways this might shape the conversation politically, the effect this might have on sort of, as I was just asking Steve, about the tone and sort of the coverage of the industry, and what, if anything, this means and how important conclusions like this really are.
I'll go first on this since I have two late teenage sons. Yes, gambling is part of their world. They don't gamble too much. They do like fantasy sports, but one of my sons anecdotally said recently he was at a college for a DECA event, and you could get onto the school's Wi-Fi, and one of his kids there from high school was 18, and he got right onto a social casino app, and they were playing blackjack and whatever else. So this is something that happens a lot. Without getting into too much specifics, like some of the teachers might even mention with the bets that they have that week, and they only bet $5, but it's very different than I remember as a teenager as far as how out in the open the betting is now.
I'm obviously very worried about this. This is my life's work, is trying to draw attention to some of these gaps and concerns that exist. We've gone from not having legalized sports betting to full-fledged glamorization of these products. And if you're not doing it, you're missing out. I'm also a mom to an 11-year-old boy, so he fits this 36% potentially. He's not engaged in gambling or fantasy, but like, it's such a component of video gaming, and they're seeing it on social media. There's this almost indoctrination into the culture even before you're supposed to legally access it. And I think this is what's been so dangerous from the industry about talking about, well, the legal, regulated products, they're so much safer. But then we read USA Today and find out that, there's hundreds upon hundreds of underage folks getting on in one state and gambling $2.78 million, right? And that's one operator, right? I think we got to start from the basics. Do parents know? Do teachers know? Like, systematically, we do not educate children or parents about the dangers and risks for gambling. We do about drugs, we do about alcohol. We've got to go back to basics and foundations here. These numbers are terrifying, and they're only going to get worse unless we do something about it.
I think Brianne's point about literacy is a good one on a couple of levels. First is just increased literacy for everyone about where gambling is actually taking place, what the surface area is for kids who are gambling. And while you will see the headlines like you saw, I think in USA Today yesterday, Brianne's point is an incredibly relevant one. It is also platforms like Roblox, right? It is also a variety of video game platforms where these are not just ideas that are indoctrinated, but where the actual games are available to play. So the surface area is different in a way that might be surprising to anyone above 25, 30, something like that. And then there's the more, I guess, common sense definition of literacy, that this is something that we don't really teach in the same way, to Brianne's point, as we do at the grade school level with drugs, with alcohol, and just having a mature conversation about what are these products, why do people engage with them, how can that engagement spiral out of control just based on how we are wired as humans, how this does transcend really any sense of choice for at least some subset of the population. That kind of literacy is blocking and tackling work. I still think it can be incredibly effective, and is something that, at least to the best of my knowledge, is not really featured in the educational environment in America.
Chris,
That's
can I
pretty
hold your feet
sweet.
to the fire a little bit? What do you
Yeah.
see about from the operator standpoint? Is there anything that we could be done? Not just about, teach the kids, and we do want them to have gambling literacy and to be familiar with what a social casino is and how unregulated it might be, for example. But is there anything you would want to see to help kids or reduce kids' access to gambling that would be either on the regulatory side or on the business side?
Sure. I'll repeat the answer I just gave about the single best thing that regulators can do, and it is that data piece. If even think about the research that we're referring to, it was really assembled very patchwork from a series of different systems, different state regulators, different levels of reporting required by different state regulators. And so as a result, you end up with a piece of research which is certainly alarming, but ends up being somewhat short of comprehensive. And I don't say that as a criticism. I mean it as the kind of comprehensive that would really be necessary to drive change and to present an unambiguous, unimpeachable view of the nature and severity of the harm. So this data exists inside of operators. Various states require reporting to various degrees. So consistency and consolidation of reporting, and then just a clearinghouse for data that's accessible by those who are qualified to have access to it, which is obviously a separate question given the nature of the data. That is just a foundational piece to getting quality research done and then driving change based on that quality research.
Brianne, I'm curious what you think, because I see you chomping at the bit, and I get a sense that you found this research sort of more persuasive maybe than Chris did.
Well, no, I don't think that Chris is wrong at all. I think that we systematically lack the data we need to be serving this population better. I do think, though, there's been a lot of cries from the industry. If you recall, Governor Hochul in her State of the State talked about underage gambling participation using biometrics. I feel like the technology has to exist out there that we could be proactively doing more to curb or prevent underage participation. No doubt there is going to be individuals, young and old, who try to find loopholes, right? And one of the pieces I read, someone said, "Oh, my 1-year-old bet." Like, okay, that's obviously someone who's trying to exploit for whatever reasons here, right? But nonetheless, I do feel like sometimes regulators aren't demanding enough from the regulated industry of this. Like, remember when 2FA wasn't a standard practice until there was this massive scandal where bank accounts were drained, right? Now we talk about 2FA. I am not the expert in technology, and I don't claim to be, but I do think if we all got in a room and got serious about it, we could probably do better right now to curb these rates. But to Chris's point, I'd like the data too. I want to see how massive of a problem this really is.
And Jonathan, sorry, Steve. This is something, and I don't represent any of the operators on this topic. And again, I'll reiterate that I think a lot of folks in the regulated world would be surprised to hear me described as a standard bearer for the regulated gambling industry.
For AIBM, you absolutely are, but I understand.
Yeah. But I think it is important to point out that if I'm DraftKings or FanDuel or any regulated sportsbook, I am not incentivized to have underage gambling on my platform, nor am I happy about having it. This is not a material source of revenue. This is an incredible source of reputational risk. The revenue, such that it even exists, is instantly voided. I'm subject to an incredible amount of fines and additional costs. So I think sometimes there's this narrative, because these are capitalist companies that are seeking to maximize profit. There is this narrative that they're benefiting tremendously from underage gambling. The reason why I say there's value to cleaner and clearer data is because that doesn't quite square with me in terms of the volume that we're seeing described, the cost on the other side against that volume. I don't necessarily know that this is something they're going to fight if there's an opportunity for common sense reform that actually improves it, because this is basically fraudulent traffic from their perspective. It is not this incredible profit center that they're Mr. Burns style, kind of moving their fingers together in glee. This is not good business for them either. So I think there's more room for everyone to, if solutions exist, to find those solutions than we might be implying with this conversation.
Yes, Steve, please.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think regulators have done a good job of setting up boxes for operators to check, but they've also, with doing that, they've also created a system where any operator that goes outside those boxes could get their hand slapped with a ruler. So that I think that if the regulators gave the industry a little more experimentation on different ways of trying to deal with this, because nothing's working. Right? Nothing is changing. So what are we doing? So if you just keep doing the same thing over and over and you're getting the same results, eventually you have to start looking at some new options. And I think there would be a lot of, to Chris's point, an 18-year-old kid is not going to be a VIP customer. It'd be a very strange 18-year-old, have to be some kind of heir to some fortune. So you're looking at people who are betting very small amounts. These are not customers that you technically would want in your ecosystem for all the reasons Chris listed. Plus, they just don't have a lot of money. There's always every 2 years is the Las Vegas Visitors Survey, which tells you how, oh, millennials don't gamble. And this was when back 10 years ago. And now it's Gen Z don't gamble. It's like, no. Young people don't really gamble. That's the problem. You give them 20 years and all of a sudden there isn't a millennial problem in Las Vegas anymore, right? So that we have this situation where I really would, personally, from my perspective, would love to see regulators allow a little more freedom on the operator end to be like, hey, you have an idea, bring it to us, try it, see what works. Everybody was against Game Sense in Massachusetts and Play My Way when casino industry launched. They were telling you how the sky would fall if you implemented it, and now MGM kind of has it at all of their properties. So there is this idea that we need to experiment with things that might seem counterintuitive at first, but maybe aren't. Right, like my friend Jamie Salzberg says all the time, the 21 plus advertising in Massachusetts on the Green Monster. Is that telling kids don't bet there? Or is it saying I can't wait till I'm 21 and can bet there? Like which one? Oh, that's the adult thing to do. I can't wait till I'm the adult. And maybe then when they're 19, they're trying to find those workarounds that we're kind of alluding to here.
Not to disagree. I hear Chris and Steve so much, but like I don't disagree that this is bad for business and optics, but these are capitalist entities that are disincentivized for asking the hard question or going to find out how bad it is if they're not required to. And I think that's where my frustration and the lack of data requirements are, right? There are systems out there that could do, evidentiary-led early detection for problem gambling. You don't see that systematically incorporated in these businesses because nobody's requiring such. I think when it comes to underage gambling, if we could start from at least a baseline of like, you are required to monitor this, you are required to innovate and do everything you can to stop. I just don't think that these companies are incentivized in any way to stop it if someone's not saying your license could be compromised if you don't do this. I guess I'm not entirely disagreeing. I just feel like I'm being difficult here. All right.
And we did get a sort of a follow-up question on this point, which is even if it's not about providing children with actual access to the apps themselves, which of course FanDuel and DraftKings, won't do. But it is about, sort of to Steve's point about the Green Monster, it is about sort of the normalization and sort of the cultural rise, which is, I think, something that we are all reckoning with or dealing with for the first time just now 8 years after the Murphy decision. Is you have people who are not born yet who are now, to Chris's point, on Roblox and are sort of being set up to become gamblers maybe within the first few years. And that is what's new. And that is something that I think parents are dealing with. And I think regulators, as always, are playing catch up to deal with, and might take a few years before they sort of have their ducks in a row.
I think there's some important context to wrap around that. The spread of sports betting is unprecedented. And the visibility of sports betting as a form of gambling in the media is, I believe, also unprecedented. It is also happening within the broader context of other massive expansions of gambling in the US that maybe have taken place over the space of 5s of years as opposed to a couple of years, 5s or 10s of years. But if you think about the expansion of casino gambling in the US, that has transformed the landscape of America during my lifetime. If you think about the expansion of distributed gambling, I spent a lot of time in Chicago, and you cannot drive through Chicago or the suburbs without seeing slots on basically every corner. And then you think about the broader backdrop of the ubiquity of forms of gambling like the lottery, which are available sometimes not on every corner, but on 3 points of a 4-point intersection. There is a sea of gambling in the US. The sports betting expansion has definitely made that sea larger and roiled the waters, but we should not kid ourselves that it is the only source of that expansion or even the primary source of that expansion, as visible as it might be. Policymakers are making decisions on a regular basis that expansion across multiple forms and formats is good for them and their state. And that's ultimately the root of this expansion.
Yeah. Well, it's a helpful reminder, but we are going to have to wrap it there. And like Steve's beloved crosswalks in Germany, we're going to run on time. So I thank you to Chris, to Steve, and to Brianne and everyone for joining us and for listening. And please, you can read more about our work, AIBM.org, and we put some links in the chat here for folks who are joining us live. But thank you again to our panelists and everyone for joining us. And good luck in the Super Bowl with whatever your bets might be.